How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Daled, Daf 54 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, exciting day today at Babble on Talmud. Finally, after 12 days, almost 2 weeks of Perek Elu tereifos, a very amazing, very challenging, almost 2 weeks of Perek Elu tereifos, we get up to the next mishnah. It's a mishnah that we've kind of referenced throughout, whereas the first mishnah was about Elu tereifos. This next mishnah is about Elu keshairos. So we've kind of been bouncing back and forth here, throughout kind of the last 2 weeks. So we're finally getting up to the next mishnah of Elu keshairos. So this is exciting. We're going to wrap up kind of just some final thoughts from the first mishnah of Elu tereifos, and we'll be moving on to the second mishnah, Elu keshairos. So friends, there is some really interesting Gemaras, in my opinion, on today's daf. So I hope that you will join me and enjoy yourselves and ourselves as we learn together Daf Nun Daled of Masechta Chullin. All right, friends, we begin on Daf Nun Daled Amid Aleph, 4 lines into the page. Yosef Rav Yitzchok Bar Shmuel Bar Marta Kamadir of Nachman v'Yosef v'Ka'amar. It says Rav Yitzchok Bar Shmuel Bar Marta before Rav Nachman, Drusa she'amru tzricha bedika, that when we talk about a drusa, an animal that has been attacked and possibly poisoned, and we have to check to see if it's a treifa, keneged b'nei me'ayim, that is, you have to check kind of the stomach, right? But the whole stomach area of the animal to look for red spots. Amalei Rav Nachman. Now Rav Nachman says to Rav Yitzchok Bar Shmuel Bar Marta, Elokim Mori Ba Rav, but Rav says Mikapa ve'ad Atma, from the spoon until the thigh. The question is, the spoon of what? My kappa, what spoon? Ile makapa diyoda, if it means essentially the socket that the thigh bone sockets into, the ball and socket of the thigh bone. Well, ela mikapa, no, where am I? Diyoda hainu kinege b'nei me'ayim. Well, that's essentially the same thing, right? Rabbi Yitzchak, I'm going to refer to Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Marta as Rabbi Yitzchak said it's less of a mouthful. So Rabbi Yitzchak has said that we have to check the stomach area. Rav Nachman is saying, what do you mean? We have to check from the kappa until the atma. The atma are the thighs. The question is, what's the kappa? If it means the hand socket, I think I said thigh socket, but the arm socket, right? If it means the arm socket to the thigh socket, the thing is that that's essentially the same thing as the stomach, right? The stomach of an animal is essentially between its hind legs and its forelegs, and from the arm socket to the leg socket is the same thing between the hind legs and the forelegs. So for Rav Nachman to say, what are you talking about the stomach? It's the kappa to the atma. That's the same thing. So ela mi kappa de mocha. No, it's from the cavity, from the space in the skull that the brain rests in. So essentially from the brain down to the thighs. So that includes also the kana and the veshet and that stuff. So mikapa de mocha ad atma, essentially from the brains down to the hind legs. Okay, fine. Kisalik Rav Chia Bar Yosef, when Rav Chia Bar Yosef made aliyah from Babble to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkochinu Reb Yechanan v'Shlakish Givaldig. So Rav Chia Bar Yosef, he made aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and there in Eretz Yisrael he finds Reb Yechanan and Rish Lakish having bichavrusa mamish. Can you only imagine getting to Eretz Yisrael, and there they are, Reb Yechanan and Rish Lakish in the Beis HaMedrash. The Yasve v'Kamre, and they were learning the sugya drusa she'amru tzricha bedika kineged b'nei me'ayim, that when we're checking an animal that has been attacked and possibly poisoned, we have to check the stomach. Omar luhu, and Reb Chia Bar Yosef says to them, Ho Elokim Moriba Rav mikapa vad atma. But Rav says it's not the stomach area, it's from the kappa until the atma, like we were just describing a minute ago. Amar le Rish Lakish. Now Rish Lakish says, Manu Rav, lo yadainale. Rish Lakish says, who is this Rav? We keep on hearing about Rav. So many people keep on mentioning halachis from Rav. Who's Rav? Amar Rabbi Yechanan. So Rabbi Yechanan says to Rish Lakish, V'lo nihirale, lo sotamid. Don't you remember, Rish Lakish? This is unbelievable. Rish Lakish, don't you remember that years ago there was a Talmud, a student Shashimesh as Rebbe Rabbah. He was a Talmud of Rebbe Yehuda Anasi. Wow, what an unbelievable story. There's so many nafkaminas here. So many interesting things here. Reb Chia, and he was a student of his uncle Reb Chia. Ve'elukim says, Reb Yechanan called Osan Shanim, Shashimesh also Talmud b'yeshiva. And when Rav was here in Eretz Yisrael, and he was a Talmud of Rebbe, and he was a Talmud of Reb Chia, and he was in the Beis HaMedrash, he would have a seat. Right, that was a covet. Right, if you were one of the top students, so you would get a seat there in the Beis HaMedrash. But I, Reb Yechanan, Shimashti Bamida, during that time, I wasn't sitting in the Beis HaMedrash. I was standing in the Beis HaMedrash. Uman Govar, who Govar Bechula, and he knew everything. Says Rashi, Bechula, B'Torah of Chassidus. He knew everything. He knew Torah. He knew Chassidus. He was mamish. He was mamish top notch. Unbelievable. So many nafkaminis here. Let's go weiter for a minute. Miyad Pasach Rish Lakish v'Amar. And Rish Lakish says, yes, I remember. Yes. So many nafkaminis to this story. Bram Zchor Osa Ish Latov. Wow, yes, I remember. Sha'amru Shmuel Mipiv, that they said the following in the name of that student, in the name of this Rav. Shmuta v'shchuta kshera. Very, very interesting. Remember, Cheva, I went to a chicken shchita the other night, Thursday night. It's now Monday, maybe? Thursday night, we shechted chickens, and one of the chickens was, the shchita was psula because the chicken disconnected its trachea, it disconnected its own trachea, and therefore the shchita was psula. But says Rav that shmuta v'shchuta, this is givaldik. Basically, what happened was the shaychet, he shechted the chicken, and what happened was when he was checking the shchita, and he noticed that he had only cut through the esophagus. The trachea had disconnected itself and had slipped. He didn't cut through the trachea at all. It basically fell out of place and just slipped down. Just slipped down, and it didn't get cut at all because it just got disconnected and was out. It just moved out of the Beis HaShchi, moved out of the wherever the knife was. So says Rav Shmuta v'shchuta. Now, if when you're checking when you're checking the shchita, you see, wow, the trachea has gotten disconnected from the jaw, but it was sliced through. In the case Thursday night, it wasn't sliced through. But if it were to have been sliced through, kshera, the shchita is kshera, she'i efsher l'shmuta she'tiase shchuta. Because, like what happened on Thursday night, it got disconnected and just completely slid down to below where below where the knife would have sliced. And it wasn't sliced at all. So says Rav, exactly as was demonstrated on Thursday night, in the event that it got disconnected before the shchita, you wouldn't have sliced through the trachea at all. If you're checking the shchita and you see, okay, on the one end the trachea is disconnected from the jaw, but it was sliced through, so it's kshera because you can assume that it got disconnected after the shchita, since if it was disconnected before the shchita, as was demonstrated on Thursday night, it would have fallen out of the range of the knife and would not be sliced at all. Rabbi Yechanan says that's great, but we need to be a little bit more convinced. Yavi v'Yakiv, what you should do is, so if you are checking the shchita, if the shaychet is checking the shchita and he sees that the trachea has been disconnected from the jaw, but it's sliced through, so Rava just said that you can assume it's a kosher shchita and that it got disconnected after the shchita. Rabbi Yochanan says, just to be sure though, slice through, the chicken's already shechted, it's already dead, but slice through another part of the trachea, and compare the two slices. And what should happen, if everything's kosher, what should happen is the two slices should look different, because the first slice would have been before, right, would have been as part of the shechita. So while the chicken was still alive, or I guess technically it could be, I guess it doesn't technically have to be a chicken in this case. I don't see why it should make a difference. So you can, let's just talk about chicken anyways. But so you can take you could slice through another section of the trachea and compare the two, right? Hopefully they should look different. Why hopefully they should look different? Well, because if they're the same, then we'll assume that just like the new one was sliced post-shechita, and it looks identical to the other slice, so then that would mean that both were post-shechita, which means that the trachea was already disconnected at the time of shechita. But if they look different, then that would mean that at the time of the shechita, the trachea was not yet disconnected, and now you're slicing it after the fact, and it's going to look different than the original slice, which is when when as part of the shechita, not post shechita. So essentially, make another slice and compare them. If they look the same, then that means that they were both post shechita. If they look different, then that means that one was as part of the shechita, and the new one is post shechita. So you want them to look different. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman, and says Rav Nachman, this of course is only going to work, right? This whole theory that if it slipped, if the trachea got disconnected pre-shechita and it's puzzle, then you would have missed it, and there would be no slicing through the trachea. So that whole theory only works so long as you weren't holding the simanim at the time of the shechita. If you're holding them in place, essentially, well then v'shachat, and you slaughtered and you sliced after the shmuta sheteos shchuta. Well, in that case, it could be that even though the trachea got disconnected, you still would be able to slice through it because you were holding it in place, right? So if you weren't specifically holding the trachea in place, and you see that even though it's disconnected, it was sliced through, so then you can assume that if you weren't holding it in place and it's sliced through, even though it's disconnected, you can assume that it was a kosher shechita. If you were holding it, so then, you're holding it in place, so it could have gotten disconnected before the shechita and still would have been sliced through because you were holding it. Rabbi Yochanan says to be careful, just to kind of double check, you should make another slice and compare the two. The Shulchan Aruch, I quickly looked at the Shulchan Aruch, who says that nowadays we don't exactly know how to compare the different slices, to tell if it was before if they're the same or different. So therefore we can't really do this test. So I think Lefi the Shulchan Aruch, we wouldn't. I guess if we see that it was disconnected and we don't know if it was disconnected before or afterwards, so it could be that we're just going to assume that it is pasul shchita. Right, so I was saying before how this story is like unbelievably incredible. Why is it unbelievably incredible? Well, because we learned so many interesting things. What are the interesting things that we learn? We learn, this we kind of already knew, but we learned that Rav was a Talmud of Rebbe, and was also a Talmud of Reb Chia. We kind of knew that already. We also learned that Rabbi Yochanan was also a Talmud of Rebbe, which is very interesting because I think I've mentioned this before. Rabbi Yochanan, I always have a little bit of trouble, who were his Rebbeim? This is the first I'm realizing that Rabbi Yochanan was a Talmud of Rebbe. I always imagine Rabbi Yochanan, I'm always like having a little bit of a hard time exactly placing who Rabbi Yochanan's Rebbeim were. But Rabbi Yochanan was a Talmud of Chizkiah. Chizkiah was a Talmud who was the son of Rabbi Chia. I think he was also a Talmud of Rabbi Yanai. But here, I don't remember seeing this before. Rabbi Yochanan was also a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Right? He's talking about being in the Beis HaMedrash with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and with Rab, which is super interesting. What else does it teach us? It teaches us that Rabbi Yochanan was younger than Rav, also very interesting, because Rabbi Yochanan was the first generation Amora in Eretz Yisrael. Rav was the first generation Amora in Babble, and yet it puts some relative ages over there, right? Apparently, when Rav was already considered a more advanced and older student, and he was sitting down he had a seat in the Beis HaMedrash, Rabbi Yochanan was still younger, and he was still standing in the Beis HaMedrash. He hadn't yet moved up, which is also interesting, which also can kind of explain why Rabbi Yochanan isn't often quoting Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? He's usually quoting Chizkiah or Rabbi Yanai. probably maybe because he really maybe he was only a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi kind of towards the end of Rabbi's life. He was a young student at the time, so really his main Rebbeim was not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but was Chizkiah and Rabbi Yanai. Maybe he caught Rabbi Yehuda Nasi at the tail end, which is also super interesting because it means that Rabbi Yochanan overlapped with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Super interesting. What else is super interesting? Another thing that's super interesting is that Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, don't you also remember Rav from the Beis HaMedrash? Which is interesting because if we're saying that Rabbi Yochanan wasn't necessarily so old at the time, right, because he was still standing in the Beis HaMedrash, and Rish Lakish was already there, that's interesting because the whole interesting story of how Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish met. Rish Lakish was like the head of the robbers or whatever, and they were in the same river, in the same lake or whatever. So that must have happened when Rish Lakish, I guess, was probably a young man, right? This didn't happen when he was 40 or 50. It happened maybe when he was, 10 or 20. I don't know how old he must have been, but apparently it was when Rabbi Yochanan was still young, right? He was still standing in the Beis HaMedrash, and already Rish Lakish was there. Already at that time, they were already learning the Beis HaMedrash together. So I don't know. I feel like in my mind, I always imagined that story happened. I don't know, when Rabbi Yochanan was already Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe he was in his 40s or whatever, and Rish Lakish was maybe in his 30s also, but maybe they were young at the time. Anyways, there's just so many interesting angles in these few lines. I feel like we just shed so much light on Rebbe, Reb Chia, Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish, Rav. I feel like there's just so many things you could pull out of that little anecdote. So, anyways, and finally, for the final snippet of the first mishnah of Elu Treifis, Zeh HaKlal. This is the rule. So the mishnah had mentioned the Chai Treifis. The mishnah had mentioned Elu Treifis. These are the Treifis. It listed 18 Treifis in the mishnah. And then at the very end of the mishnah, Zeh HaKlal. This is the rule that even though we're talking about an animal that's already been slaughtered, but any of these defects that you find in the animal, that for an animal that is still alive, if they had these conditions, they would not be able to live much longer. I think within the next few days, we're going to get into that machlokas about, is it 12 months, is it longer than that? But it would not be able, right, to live indefinite, right? This is a disease that it would die from. So then it's also a treifis. So we have this kind of general rule in order to be able to learn about any scenarios that haven't yet been, that weren't listed among the chai treifis. So lasuye mai. So what's it coming to include? Lasuye shev shmaitz. If you remember from Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis, we had mentioned that there were another 4 brises and mishnayos that weren't mentioned in our mishnah, and there was also the shev shmaitza. There were another 7 treifis listed by Amoraim. So we're saying here, and this is also what we had said on Daf Mem Beis Lefi the Tana of our Mishnah, that the Zeh HaKlal can come to include those statements of the Amoraim. If you remember, there was a whole shaila because, who was it? Dever Bishmael, maybe. They had said, I think it was by the Besmedrash Rabbi Shmuel. What's this? Dever Bishmael, yeah. That they talk about the Besmedrash Rabbi Shmuel, that Daf gets 18 treifis. So we had to figure out how do these Shev Shmaitzes fit in, which is interesting. But anyways, so this rule is going to include, Lefi the Tana of our Mishnah, the Shev Shmaitza, these additional 7 treifis that listed by Amoraim and that were not listed in our Mishnah. They are also treif. Devei Yosef Rishba, by Yosef the hunter. Machu Begida, they found that if they would hit the Begida Nasha, that Begida Nashaya maybe, Begida Nasha, let's say Begida Nasha, that if they hit an animal, either with a stick or with an arrow, in the Gid Hanasha, in the sciatic nerve, of course later on in Masechta Chulin we're going to get to the Perek Gid Hanasha, but they found that if they hit an animal on the sciatic nerve, Vikatle, they would kill it. It would die. So the comment to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, so they came before Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and they said, "No, shouldn't this also be a treifa? We have experienced many times that an animal that gets hit by its sciatic nerve, by its gid anoshe, it dies. So should that be considered a treifa? So Amalahu Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir responded, very interesting. It relates also to our discussion from yesterday, science and halacha and right, the fact that we kind of can observe new phenomena that aren't accounted for in, let's say, the chai tereifos in this example. So Amalu says to them, B'chila hosef ala tereifos, yesh. What are you coming to add to the chai tereifos? Ein l'cha ela ma shemanu chachamim. All we have is the 18 listed by the chacham. Let's go weiter. The vera puppet bar Abba Rishba, puppet bar Abba was a hunter as well. Machu b'chuya. They found that if they would hit an animal by its kidney, v'katle, it would die. Also the kame to Abba, they came for Abba. Amrlu, he says to them, v'chi lehosif al ha-treifos yesh. What is you're going to add on to the treifos? Ein l'cha ela ma shemanu chacham. We only have that which the chacham listed. But we see that they're dying. I mean, you're saying we only have the ones that the chacham list, but we see that they die. Gemire de'i badre la samachaya. Yes, but in those cases, we have a tradition, I guess, or we assume that there could be some kind of a potion, some kind of a ointment or an elixir of sorts that you could put on it by the kidney and by the gid anoshe, and it would survive. So therefore, it's not listed as one of the treifos. But this is a super interesting concept here, very interesting concept, and it relates to like that shita of Rav Asher Weiss that from that shir about science and halacha. But anyways, so here you have somebody who's coming, somebody who's an expert, somebody who's a hunter, somebody who has demonstrated many times that if you hit an animal by the gid anoshe or by the kidney, it will die. So he goes and asks the shaila, shouldn't this also, if you see that it's been hit in the kidney or the gid anoshe, shouldn't that be a treifa? Right? And he says, I've noticed demonstrated that the animal dies, and nonetheless, Reb Abba or Reb Yehuda ben Beseir says, I recognize that. Yes, I recognize that it dies, but at the same time, the halacha is the halacha. Right? He says maybe in these cases you can add some kind of a lotion or a potion or ointment or something that will survive. But I think the point is like, yes, I'm not denying that the animal will die in these cases, but halacha stays the same. This is the halacha. It could be that there are other considerations. Maybe there are other scenarios of treifos, whatever. But as far as the halacha is concerned, these are the chai treifos. And now we get up to the second mishnah in Perek Elu treifos. Ve'elu keshairos. And these animals are kosher. The behema by an animal. Nikva gageres, if the trachea gets pierced, right? If the veshet, if the esophagus gets pierced, then it is a treifa. But if the trachea gets pierced, it is kosher, right? The trachea becomes a treifa once it's been sliced more than halfway through. So nikva gargeris, if the trachea is punctured. Oh, shit, nizdika, right? Of course, all the examples in this mishnah are kosher. Oh, shit, nizdika, or if it was sliced lengthwise. Right, we had learned the other day that as long as just a little bit remains at the top and the bottom, it is kosher, even if the rest is sliced lengthwise. Ad kama techsar, and if there's a hole in the trachea, how large would that hole be for it to be a trachea, a treifa? If it is the size of an Italian isar, then that hole would make a treifa. Otherwise, less than that, it is kosher. Nifchesa gulgoles, if the what's that thing called? The skull. If the skull was crushed, vilo nikav krum shamoch, but the membrane of the brain, however, remained intact, kosher. Nike balev vilo lebeis chalalo, if the heart is pierced, but not to the chambers. Nishbra ashedra, if the spine was broken, however, velo nifsak achut shela, the spinal cord is intact. Nitla kaved, if the liver has been removed, but v'nishtayre mena kazayis, but a kazayis of the kaved remains. Apparently, I looked it up earlier, that apparently as long as 10% of the liver remains, it can regenerate. Hemsis uvesakosis, the hemsis and the vesakosis, the third and second stomachs, respectively. So they kind of open up into one another, right? Food can travel between the hemsis and the beis hakosos. Shenikvu zeh lesoch zeh, and they are punctured one into the other, meaning there is no puncture from the outside into these stomachs, but as they share a wall, if the shared wall was punctured, so it's entirely an internal puncture, it is kosher. After all, there's anyways a hole between the two of them, so what's another hole between the two of them? So long as it is not punctured to the outside, then it is kosher. Nital atrol, if the spleen is missing, nitla klayos, or if the kidneys are missing. That apparently is an interesting one, because apparently without kidneys, it's questionable if an animal could survive. Nital lechia tachton, if the lower jaw has been removed, but of course in a way that would keep the trachea and esophagus connected to its meat. So you'd have to, right, because if the trachea and esophagus get disconnected, it's a treifa. So you'd have to remove the jaw, but in a way that the meat kind of remains there. But as long as you figure out how to do that, it's kosher. Nitla aim shala, if the womb is removed, the charusa bidei shemaim, or if the animal's lungs kind of shrivel because they get scared. Bidei shemaim was like some kind of like a thunder or something, not because like somebody said boo, but there was like thunder or something like that. It was from shemaim, and the animal got scared and the lungs shriveled up. So as long as it's bidei shemaim, it's kosher. Hagluda, if we've seen this before, if the skin is missing, maybe it got like boils or something, and it lost its skin, which is insane. But it lost its skin either through getting boils or somehow through working. So Rav Meir says it's kosher, but Chacham posel, and Chacham say that without skin, an animal is posel. Sheesh, that sounds absolutely atrocious to not have skin. Says the Gemara, Itmar Rabbi Yochanan Omar Elu Treifes Davka, Reb Shimon ben Lakish Omar Elu Keshairos Davka. Okay. You see, when it says Elu is a limiting word. Elu, these, and nothing else. Therefore, when it says Elu Treifes, so it means these are treifos, everything else is kosher. When it says Elu Keshairos, it means these are kosher, everything else is treif. So one of them is going to be, I mean, it doesn't say it explicitly, but I feel like the implicit kind of point here is that one of them needs to be literal and the other one not, right? Because then you're going to have things that fall through the cracks, right? Basically, if you say that these are treif, everything else is kosher, and these are kosher, everything else is treif, so then basically anything that isn't listed in either mishnah, kind of, what is it? Is it kosher or is it treif? But anyways, So that's precisely the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. That Rabbi Yochanan says that the literal elu is elu treifis, that these are treif, everything else is kosher. And in terms of elu keshairos, that is just for consistency, but it's not to say that everything else is treif. And Rish Lakish disagrees. He says elu keshairos, these are kosher, and everything else is treif. And in terms of elu treifis, that was, again, just for consistency, but it's not literal. Okay, again. Itmar was stated, Rabbi Yochanan, Amar says, Rabbi Yochanan, elu treifis davke. When it says elu treifis, these are treif, so these are treif, everything else is kosher. In terms of elu keshairos, not to be taken literally. Reb Shimon ben Lakish says the opposite. Omar, elu keshairos, these are kosher, davka, specifically these are kosher, everything else is treif. And in terms of elu treifis, that's not to be taken literally. B'maika mifliye, what's the machlokes? But Rav Masna, they're arguing about Rav Masna. Rav Masna was an Amora, and Rav Masna listed one of the Shev Shmaitza. One of the 7 Amoroic treifas are Dam Rav Masna hay buka de atma de shaf miduchte treifa. The buka de atma. The buka de atma is the thigh bone that has like a ball. It's like a ball that fits into right? So the thigh bone as like a ball that fits into the hip, into a socket. And if that gets dislodged, if the thigh bone gets dislodged, so it says Rav Masna, that's a treifa. And there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about whether they accept that. So again, Rav Masna, Rav Masna, hay buka de atma, this thigh bone, that the shaf miduchte that gets dislodged from the hip, treifa. So it says Rav Masna, that's a treifa, and it's one of the Shev Shmaitza, one of these 7 Amoraic treifas. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, so it says Rabbi Yochanan, Elu treifas, davka tnan. I'm sorry. Elu treifas davka. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Elu treifas, these are treif. What's listed in the Mishnah are treif, but not the thigh bone. That he disagrees with Rav Masna. He said that's not going to be a treifa. Now, our Mishnah, the first Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Perek Elu treifas says, Tana treifas, v'tana zeh klal. The Mishnah, right, the first Mishnah Masechta in Perek Elu treifas says that these are the 18 treifas, but then the Mishnah ends with a rule. And this is the rule that whenever the animal would die, it is also treif. Now, v'chazia l'dir Rav Masna, however, the Tana of that Mishnah, however, did realize that there was what about this thigh bone? Right? Because we had this general rule, any situation where the animal would die, it's also treif. What about this thigh bone? The asib b'zeh klal, I may have thought that it should be included in that rule, that the rule would also include Rav Masna's treifa of the thigh bone that got dislodged. So my time, how come you would think to include the thigh bone as a treifa? The damya linatule, because it's similar to like a liver, right? If you lose the liver, right? If the liver is gone, so it's a treifa. So here also, if the thigh bone is dislodged from the hip, it would be considered like it's gone, and it should be a treifa. So therefore, Tana Elu treifas, therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that is why the Mishnah specifically said Elu treifas. No. These 18 are treif. Haneu the treifa, these are treif. Had Rav Masna kshera. To exclude Rav Masna's example, Rav Masna's example is kosher. Okay? So the Mishnah says, right, the Mishnah lists 18 treifas and also has a general rule that could be applied to other scenarios. And I may have thought to apply that general rule to Rav Masna's scenario about the dislodged thigh bone. Elu treifas, to exclude the dislodged thigh bone. That is Reb Yochanan's opinion, who says that Elu treifas is literal, and in terms of Elu keshairos, that's just for symmetry, for consistency, but that Elu keshairos is not to be taken literally. Now, Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Rish Lakish says the opposite. Omar Elu keshairos davka. Rish Lakish says that Elu keshairos, the Mishnah that lists what's kosher, only those are kosher. Of Masna's scenario about the thigh bone is treif. Tana treifes v'tana zeh klal, that the first Mishnah in Perek Elu treifes listed 18 treifes and then also gave us a rule to apply. V'chazia l'dir Rav Masna delo asur b'zeh klal. But the Tana of the second Mishnah of Elu keshairos, which is the one to be taken literally, realized, according to Rish Lakish, how he learns things, that the Tana realized that Rav Masna's scenario of the thigh bone would not have been included in the zeh klal, right? The general rule at the end of the previous Mishnah that comes to include even treifas that weren't listed in the Mishnah would fall short and would not include Rav Masna's treifa of the thigh bone. How come? My time. Because lav l'nekuve damya, well, because the dislodged thigh bone is not like, the veshet that's been punctured, for example. V'lo l'psuke damya, it's also not like the spinal cord, for example, that was broken, that got like split. V'netule nami lo damya, and it's also not similar to, and it's also not going to be similar to an organ that's missing, like the liver being missing. So I may have thought that it would not be included in the tereifos. So therefore, Tana Elu keshairos. So says Rish Lakish. That's why the second mishnah says Elu keshairos. These are kosher. Hani the keshairos. These are kosher. Other of Masna treifa, but Rav Masna's scenario is going to be, but Rav Masna's scenario is treif. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, when it says Elu tereifos, it's to say that these are tereifos, but the thigh bone is kosher. Rish Lakish says when it says Elu keshairos, it's to say that these are keshairos, but the thigh bone is treif. Gufa, we said, Amar of Masna, says of Masna, Buka de Atma, the thigh bone, the shaf miduchte, which was dislodged from the hip bone, treifa, is treif. Rava Amar says Rava ksheirer. The ifsik nive treifa. Rava says that the thigh bone that gets dislodged would be ksheirer, it would not be a treifa. But if the tendon that holding the thigh bone in the socket gets broken, so then it is a treifa, even according to Rava. Vilchsa, the halacha is if signami kshera, that even if the tendon is broken, it's kshera. Adam is akla, is akule. It's got to be kind of like decomposed. It's got to like really go away, that tendon. So if the thigh bone gets dislodged from the hip and the tendon holding them together is completely gone, so then it would be a treifa. The Mishnah had said at Kama Techsa v'chulei. The Mishnah had said that if you have a hole in the trachea, so once it's the size of a Italian isar, so then the trachea then the animal is treif. Omar, but until then it's kosher. Omar Zeiri says Zeiri, Atun, Zeiri says to the students there, Atun delo mischame lechon shiura, that if you don't recognize what an Italian isar is, shiura bedinra kordina. However, you do recognize what a Kurdish, I think Kurdistan, what a Kurdish dinar is. So it's that. It's a Kurdish dinar. Super interesting. Sounds like Kurdistan is mentioned in the Gemara, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool. I mean, I don't know if it's historically correct, but if so, it's pretty cool that Kurdistan is mentioned in the Gemara. Like, we don't really see Iraq mentioned or Iran. It just talks about Babble. But here it's talking about Kurdistan. Unless this is something else. But anyway, it's super interesting. The Vave Kipshita Zutrasi, and it's also like, I guess, our small pshitas. Umishtakha bene pshite de Pumbedisa. I guess it's also among the little coins of Pumbedisa. Amr of Chana Pasara says of Chana, the money changer. Ila minoi havakoi by nafcha, says Rav Chana, the money changer. One time I looked up, and who was standing above me? Rabbi Yochanan, the bar nafcha. Rashi gives two pshat. Rashi somewhere else in where's this Rashi? In Sanhedrin. It says that it could have been called bar nafcha because his father was a blacksmith. I believe his father died before he was born, I think. But it could be because his father was a blacksmith or because he was very beautiful. Okay, I guess bar nafcha would imply that he was beautiful. Anyways, so it says Reb Chana, the money changer, that one time he looked up and there was Rabbi Yochanan standing there. Va'a mini dinra kordina, and he asked if, I was a money changer, I had a whole bunch of coins out. He asked for a kordi dinar, the sharebe trefosa, so that he can measure a hole in a trachea to determine if the animal is treif. Uvay the meka mikame, and says Rab Chana the money changer, he says, I wanted to stand up. I mean, Rabbi Yochanan, the great Rabbi Yochanan, was standing in front of me. I wanted to stand up out of honor. V'lo shavkani, but he did not allow me to stand up. Amarli, he says to me, Shev ben Shev, sit. Ein baile umanios rashoyin lamod mipnei talmidei chacham b'shah she'asukim b'melachtam. Workers are not permitted to stand to give honor to talmidei chachamim when they are working. Rashi explains that what this means is that Reb Chana, the money changer, did not own his own business. He was an employee. He was working for somebody else, and therefore his responsibility was to be doing business and bringing in more business, and therefore that is why he shouldn't be standing up for Talmidei Chacham. Rather, should be focused on the work that he was involved in. Fragdi Gemara below. Really? People at work should not be standing up for Talmidei Chacham. We learned in a mishnah Masechta Bikurim that when people would come to Yerushalayim with Bikurim, which was a whole event. The mishnah in Masechta Bikurim, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Gimel, describes how they would come and they would bring the Bikurim on cows, and the horns of the cows would be covered in gold, and they would take like reaps of olive branches and put it on the cow's head, and Mamash, they'd get to Yerushalayim and they would send word that they were coming, and all the people would come out, and when they get to Yerushalayim, all the store owners, what does it say? It says they would get to Yerushalayim, Kol Baile Umanios, all of the shopkeepers, Omdim Mipneim, would stand up for the people bringing their Bikurim, Vishoalim Bishlomen, and they would say, Shalom Aleichem, V'omim, they would say, Lehem, Achenu, Anshim Akomploni, our brothers from wherever they were coming from Tel Aviv, by Achem the Bishalom, come in peace. So we see that when it came to Bikurim, the shopkeepers would stop what they were doing and get up in order to honor the people who would bring the Bikurim. Rabbi Yochanan says, sure, yeah, that's correct. The Mishnah says that the shopkeepers would stand up give honor to the people bringing the Bikurim, but not for Talmidei Chacham. Rabbi Yossi bar Oven says, Rabbi Yossi bar Oven, Borei kama chaviva mitzvah b'shaita, says Rabbi Yossi bar Oven, come and see how important it is to be mechabev, to show love for a mitzvah at its proper time. As we see that the shopkeepers wouldn't stand up for Talmidei Chachamim, but they would stand up for the mitzvah of Bikurim. Mimai, why is that necessarily a raya in general? Why is that necessarily proof that generally chavivin mitzvah b'shaita? I mean, maybe chavivin mitzvah b'shaita, sure, but this is not necessarily a proof, because dilma kedei shelote nimtza machshil nosulav. Maybe the reason why the shopkeepers would get up is not out of honoring the mitzvah, but in order to encourage the people that are bringing Bikurim, to encourage them that we are showing them love and supporting them and encouraging them to bring Bikurim, so that they will continue to bring Bikurim next time around, right? Imagine they came and they schlepped and they brought their Bikurim to Yerushalayim, crickets, nobody really cared. That wouldn't be such a fun experience. But you come to Yerushalayim, Mamish, the Mishnah describes they would play the flute. They would be playing the flute and singing songs, and the whole town, the community would come out and welcome them, and all the shopkeepers. It was Mamish like you were a celebrity. So it was in the interest of encouraging the people who are bringing Bikurim to have a mamish, like the best possible experience, so that they will want to do it again the following year. Friends, that was Daf Nun Daled of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Nun Daled of Masechta Chullin, we wrapped up the first mishnah of Elu tereifos. We had discussed where exactly you need to check, how exactly to check for an animal that has been attacked, whether it's under the stomach, or whether it's from the brains all the way down to the legs. We had a really interesting anecdote with Reb Yochanan and Rish Lakish reflecting on their time together in the Beis HaMedrash, in Rebbe's Beis HaMedrash, when Rav was there at the time, which is I thought it was a very interesting anecdote. And then we wrapped up that first mishnah discussing about that Zeh Klal, the general rule in the first mishnah that came to include the Shev Shmaitza, those additional 7 tereifos of the Amoraim. We then moved on to the second mishnah of Elu tereifos that talks about Elu ksherin b'behema, right? That these are kosher by the animal. We saw by animals. So the first mishnah talked about listed 18 tereifos, and here we listed scenarios that are kosher. We saw machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish concerning Rav Masna's treifa about if the thigh bone gets disconnected from the hip. Rabbi Yochanan says that it would be kosher. Rish Lakish says that it would be treif. And then we saw an interesting discussion really about a hole in the trachea being the size of a Italian Isser, which essentially led to the story with Reb Chana, the money changer, when Reb Yochanan needed to borrow a coin to check for a treifa, and that led to an interesting discussion about standing up for Talmidei Chachamim in general while one is working, and how that relates to the Bikurim. So that was very, very interesting. Friends, I hope you enjoyed Daf Nun Daled of Masechta Chullin. I will have a great day. I will catch you tomorrow.